Hi everyone, Simon from Horoma Studio. Today we're gonna have a look at this new image depicting the Seashore Library by Vector Architects. So the overall idea was to have this sort of like peaceful look from like early morning with nice like color grading and things like that. So we're gonna talk about that. I think we're gonna mainly talk about colors actually, but still there are like many things that we can talk about before that. So first things first, I think the overall composition is really nice. It's really like, it actually reminds me of the Rhine picture of Andras Gursky, even though like is a bit more complicated, but like having the sort of river line or whatever that is here, or the sea probably, and the different like line and depth is really like picturesque. So I really like it. The way the building is positioned, I think, is really nice. Even though we like have a frontal thing, we have this sort of like balance in between these two guys and this one, which is, I think, extremely nice in terms of composition. Basically, the light also is really interesting because we have it like it's sort of like a backlit thing, but it is interesting because, or like it's really well thought because it means the building is dark, but since it's lit from the inside, it's like a library and you have like all the artificial light, so we can see stuff happening inside. It's also extremely peaceful because there's nothing happening and we only have like this guy, or woman actually, I think. I don't know. I think it's a guy. One thing I think that is a little bit weird is like the reflection of the glass is non-existent, whereas I think we might have some reflection happening. It is fine, but still, I think it could be interesting to have slightly more reflection in some areas. The same way, like the texture here is not the most easy to understand. I don't get if it's like some sort of glazed bricks or if it's something else, but it's not important because I mean, like, the overall thing is about the atmosphere, which I think is working really well. So this is nice. What am I doing? Sorry. Look. Up. So the composition I think is fine, or like even more than fine. I also like really what's happening in the foreground here because we have the reflection, which is really interesting. So as I said earlier, I think what we're going to focus on is the colors that I think could be like slightly better. So what I started doing, I know that lately I'm just like annotating, but since it's color stuff, I actually took like a couple of minutes to do the changes. So what I did was like darken the whole thing but you'll see later that I'm actually lighting it up, but still. Basically, I've darkened the thing because I think the contrast was a bit lacking before. If you look at the black and white, whoops, not this one, black and white, you can see it's like, there's not much contrast. And even though it can make sense because we have like, basically if it's like early morning, you have this sort of like water particle in the sky that sort of diffuse the whole light, it means you're gonna have like extremely low contrast, but still I think it would be interesting to have slightly darker foreground. What I did after was changing a bit the hue because I wasn't really happy with the overall, like, it's this sort of like sand basically, looks really dull, and I think it was like, it would be interesting to play more with like the fact that in early days or early in the day you're gonna have like more interesting shades of blue and orange and stuff like that, instead of having like a more what's the word, like neutral color. So basically I'm using a color what's it called, color balance, and just playing around with the midtones here. So you can see the difference is pretty strong, but we'll play with it again. This is when I'm lazy, I'll just like use the brightness contrast and just pull the contrast all the way down. It helps in like just having like a more homogenized look. One thing I didn't tell you is that the overall mask, like the whole thing is masked in the upper part, so I'm not changing the sky yet. Another color balance I played with this time was with the highlight, I think. Yes, because basically I was unhappy with like the way these part looked and the inside of the thing. So basically I'm sort of like warming up these areas, and especially the interior. The other thing here is to sort of brighten it up slightly more, because well, it might be too much, but still we'll see later. But because in terms of contrast, again, it was maybe like it needed a little bit more punch. Here is just like a multiply layer with a hue I think was quite fitting, which is sort of purplish, well, whatever. But basically it's changing slightly the overall color of the blue thing. Here's the same with the yellow, which is happening here. And the last thing I did was using a saturation layer and just desaturating, because it was something quite weird happening with the water here, is that the color it was reflecting, even though I've changed it, but here I didn't change anything yet. And the color it's reflecting is extremely dark. Whereas what it could be interesting is to actually have this like acting as a sort of like reflecting panel or whatever, so that it's actually quite bright. So that's why I've desaturated it and amped up the value. So if I look at the reds here, you can see, well, it's actually saturated, but I changed the hue because it was not the right hue basically. So I've changed it to that, and I've boosted up the lightness so that we have something here a bit more interesting. I actually played around a little bit more with the curves here so that we have like this sort of nice reflection here that is like, I think creates a nice area compared to what we had before. You can see, which was a little bit too calm, let's say. Here, other stuff I tried to play around with again was, this guy. Something that I think was a little bit lacking as well is what was happening with the only character here, because in the same way that I've increased the contrast here, I could also increase the contrast here, and I could do it like with this sort of color away by adding a sort of blue thing, and it also helps in like making it stand out from the background, because otherwise it sort of loses the strength it could have. Because you can see here, if I not this guy here, if I turn it off, this is extremely strong. This is like has an interesting contrast, but here you don't really read the guy, whereas if you do not this but that, you can read the silhouette, which is way more interesting in terms of balance. Another thing I did was to simplify the hue for the overall sky, because as you can see here, we have like a really strong gradient from purple to blue, which maybe it's realistic, but I guess like this one is realistic too. And we have like this sort of like softer look of early mornings, which is quite nice, I think. And another thing I did was just to play around again with brightness and the contrast basically, because I ended up having this, but it's like the contrast is maybe too much. And as I said, when you're like kind of lazy, you just use like a brightness contrast adjustment layer, put the contrast, well, I could actually put it all the way down, it's fine. And what you do is you just duplicate it until you're happy with the result. So here would actually be a little bit too much. What I could do is like, because the idea is you can keep like what we had with the sky, but I guess the rest has to be changed. And here, I don't know, maybe 60 or something like that. Oh, it's not changing for some reason. So yeah, something like that I think works quite well, because here we had like the contrast. What am I doing? The contrast here was way too much. Here it's nice. Here I think it's good. Maybe there's a sweet spot in between, but basically you get the idea. So that's pretty much the whole thing. I mean, you can see the difference in terms of color palette. It is sort of like more homogenized. We have like a better feeling of this sort of haze that you could have in the early morning, while still keeping a stronger contrast. Actually, I think we should lower this slightly. Oops. Yeah, better. But yeah, as you can see, basically by sort of homogenizing the hue between homogenizing the hue between the river or the sea, sorry, and the sky, we get a more homogenized look. We also get like a better contrast, which helps us in reading the building and the dude here and the moon here. And also in terms of hue, I think it's more legible in terms of like what's the actual time of the day, and it's like had a softer look, especially for the sky. So I guess that will be everything I'll talk about for now. I hope you've learned interesting tips in there and that you sort of agree with the correction and find them useful. And I'll see you in the next teardown. Thanks guys. Bye.